also have a little bit of a French-American comparison, but it's a touch buried. I'm going to talk today about wine grapes. I just started my lab a little over a year ago, so I'm going to tell you about, my goal is to give you a little overview of what the lab goes for, what we study, what we're trying to actually understand, and then how wine grapes fits into it, and tell you about the research program we have. Okay, so to get to the major question that my lab addresses, we have to start here. This is a figure I bet many of you are familiar with. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 2007 Working Group 1 report, and it is our best estimate with a business as usual scenario of the warming the Earth will experience over the next 80 years, so by the end of this century. What I want you to take away is twofold. One, note that this legend on the bottom is in addition to the warming already experienced. So we start at 0, but 0 is really a 0.6 to 0.7 degree warming increase that's already happened. And secondly, take a look at the terrestrial biosphere. What we are projecting is a minimum, really, of a 2-degree warming event across the terrestrial system, which really is where most of our crops are. So this is a radical warming event. I'm a community ecologist. I am broadly trying to answer the question of how will plant species respond to such radical changes in warming that we are creating for them. We know there are 2 major things that happen already, and those are that wild species tend to shift in space, and they tend to shift in time. And my goal is to try to better understand that with the ultimate goal of can we predict it, and is there any hope of mitigating those consequences? And I focus primarily on changes in time. And those changes in time are phenological shifts. So phenology is the timing of recurring life history events. The day that a bird starts its migration, the day that a first leaf comes out on your maple tree in your backyard, the day of first flower. It's also the timing of crop events. So the day that we sow seeds of wheat is a phenological event. It has human influences, but it's predominantly a phenology event related very strongly to our crop systems and to humans. It's also the date of fruit maturation, that's a phenological event, and the date of crops, the date of crop harvest. And so I'm really interested in how we can leverage crop systems, and in particular wine grapes, to answer the question of how will wild species actually shift with climate change? How can we better predict that? And I'll tell you why I use wine grapes in 2 parts. The first part is that wine grapes are hyper-diverse and yet genetically very narrow. So all the different wine that you drink comes from different varieties of wine grapes. Wine grapes are a subspecies, Vitis vinifera, subspecies vinifera. They are genetically less diverse than even a species. And then we have varieties. So Pinot Noir is a variety of wine grape. Cabernet Sauvignon is another one. So if you like Pinot, you like one genetic genotype, basically, of wine grape. And if you like Cabernet Sauvignon, that's a slightly different genetic type of wine grape. And what we see is that these are hyper-diverse in their phenology. So different varieties of wine grape come out at very different times of year. So these are data from Winters, California, where they've planted all together in a garden about 1,500 different varieties of wine grape. There are arguably about 5,000 different varieties of wine grape, so I'm sure you've sampled only a tiny, tiny fraction, no matter how hard you've worked at it. The number of varieties is here on the vertical axis. You can see it goes up to 600, so a lot of different varieties represented here. But what I want you to take away is the variation here on the horizontal axis. Over a month in the blue histogram of variation in when these different varieties leaf out. And again, that's genetically very little variation, yet phenologically huge variation. And then if we look at the flowering in pink, the mean bloom time, again, well over a month of variation. So I'm interested in this because we want to understand not just how phenology shifts with climate change, but I argue that many, many plant traits shift with climate change, and we tend to use phenology as this major indicator, but we're actually seeing shifts in entire syndromes, so things like the stomata that Missy just mentioned. And so I'm trying to leverage wine grapes to understand that shift in plant syndrome versus just phenological shift with climate change. And let me give you an example of why I think wine grapes are good for this. So here's one major trait, aspects of leaf shape. These are 2 of the earliest varieties of wine grape. This is Chardonnay over on the left, and Pinot Noir, very early red, over on the right. And then 2 of the latest varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon on the bottom on the left, and Barbera, an Italian grape, over on the right. So these are grapes that you harvest first. They leaf out first. They have short growing seasons. These are grapes you harvest last. They take a long growing season to get them to maturity and to harvest them. And hopefully you see there is huge phenological leaf diversity here. The lobing varies, the toothing varies, the vein structure varies, and so we're trying to leverage wine grapes to understand that. We have a project going on in Davis, California, 150 different varieties planted together. We monitor multiple phenological stages throughout the year to get working on that. The other reason I study wine grapes, and I think they're great for better understanding phenological shifts with climate change, is that we have tremendous phenological records of wine grapes. Wine grape harvest records in Burgundy, France go back to before 1300. So we have extremely long-term data, which is quite rare, obviously, for humans, period, and for phenology as well. These are the records going back to 1600. This is a composite index of harvest records from across France. The red line is just a smoothing mean for 5 years. And the harvest date is relative to the 1st of September. So that 0 is when you harvest on the 1st of September. Negative numbers, you harvest early. Positive numbers, you harvest late. You can see this signal of climate change at the end. And so these long-term records let us do a lot of things we can't usually do. We can do simple things like say what actually triggers harvest date in wine grapes, and this is not surprising. These are correlations, so a correlation index here on the right. For temperature on the left and precipitation on the right, we're looking at May to July temperatures. Not surprisingly, these blue negative numbers, hotter summers lead to earlier harvests. And here looking at the reds, more precipitation, wetter summers lead to later harvests. This isn't shocking, but because we have these long-term records, we can do something we can't usually do. We can start thinking about what are the drivers of things we care about. So early harvests tend to be higher quality wine. It's not that every early harvest is the best vintage, but in general, if you harvest early, it is a very good predictor of how high quality that wine will be and how much you will sell it for per bottle in France. So these are climate composites of all the years where the harvest was 10 days earlier than average, so a significantly early harvest. And they're composites. We're just looking at the mean response across all these early harvest years. So temperature again on the right, a measure of soil moisture or drought, the Palmer Drought Severity Index shown here on, temperature on the left, Palmer Drought Severity on the right. Not surprisingly, these early years are hot years and they are dry years. But let me tell you what's interesting is we can say how consistent is this across time? Has this continued across all different types of climate epochs and with climate change? So we divided the data in two pieces, 1950, so all the data 1600 to before 1950 on the left side. Just looking at the recent period after 1950 on the right. And this is temperature again, these composite mean indexes. So you see that the early years before and after 1950 are hot. They're significantly hotter after 1950 because it's gotten much hotter in Europe with climate change. But when we look at that drought metric, that soil metric, we see a shift. So here it is before 1950 over on the left, and here is after 1950, the more recent years over on the right. What you see is that drought used to be a major driver of these early harvests, and very surprisingly to us, it no longer is. So early harvests in France, which are still strongly correlated with higher quality, pricier wines, are no longer for some reason linked to drought, and this is a major question that my lab is working on currently.